I just passed my cheerleading exam.
Did you, Pete?
I did. I said to them, give me an A, and they did. That was pretty bad, wasn't it?
I feel like you are indeed once again scraping the barrel of humour. But welcome everybody to the Constant Geekery podcast, season 3, episode 15. And today we're talking about the M2 MacBook Pro 13-inch, which is now out in the wild.
Yes.
People have them. The reviews are out. And
are people going wild?
I don't know that they're necessarily going wild. I do, however, think, sticking with the wildlife theme, that there may indeed be a couple of elephants in the room and possibly some stuff that Apple forgot to mention.
Okay, interesting.
And so we're going to get to that as our main topic. And as always, there's chapter markers in the description if you want to skip straight to that bit. But first of all, Pete, I think it's time to do the news. And we probably should say as well, we've got Erin here.
I was going to say, not only do we have elephants in the room, we also have idiots in the room.
Wow. Okay. No need for that. And yeah, I'm here. I'm always here.
Did I say it was you? You've just jumped to that conclusion.
I think it was for implication, actually.
Well,
I think it's interesting that you automatically assume that it was you, Erin.
Yeah, well, it does tend to be, doesn't it? Yeah.
In fairness, if you were using history as a gauge of what's going to happen, then I can understand why you might come to that conclusion.
To be fair, she hasn't made any mistakes in the last 2 minutes.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
Anyway, yes, moving on to some news.
Okay, what do you think about this? I'm interested to get your point of view, actually, Erin.
Okay.
Are you of the persuasion where you like a bedtime story?
No.
Okay. Imagine that you were. Did you like bedtime stories when you were little?
Yeah.
Imagine if you could have your bedtime story read to you by a computer pretending to be the voice of someone you really care about who is dead.
That is horrendous. That is horrendous.
Can I just stop you there? They don't have to be dead. You don't say, Amazon, can you read in Mum's voice? It's like, only if she doesn't do it that way. Alexa, even.
I understand that. This is the story anyway. Amazon's Alexa will apparently soon be able to read you stories in a loved one's voice, even if they're dead.
Yeah. So, for example, Dave could read you a bedtime story.
That is, I'm not loving anything about
Sorry,
this.
I'm not going to take that. I was good at reading bedtime stories to my boys. I did all the voices and everything in all the books. Did all the voices for the Gruffalo, Squash and a Squeeze, all of the favourites, you know.
Yeah, I did that as well with my boys. I'm very good at voices. Yeah. Might I inquire as to where you keep the spoons? That kind of thing.
If anybody has watched Salad Fingers, and if you haven't, my recommendation to you is do not do that. Do not do that. It is deeply disturbing. But if they have watched it, they'll be wondering why Salad Fingers has got ever so slightly more camp and has taken on a Northern England accent.
I was trying to speed it up a little bit.
Oh, okay.
But anyway. So the story here is that Alexa will soon be able to mimic people's voices.
Yeah. So Amazon aren't the first people to do this. Microsoft have already done that, I believe. And I suspect lots of people are working on such things. And it is a technology that is obviously open to abuse.
Yeah. It's been used in film and TV already. So obviously, you know, we've seen examples of actors and actresses who've perhaps gone past their sell-by date, not necessarily died, but are reprising a role of when they were younger. So that kind of technology, but it has also been used for those that have died to bring them back.
I didn't know they'd used the voice. I have seen the AI. I mean, I remember going to see Tron the first time and seeing what they did to Jeff Bridges. That was amazing.
It was incredible. Yeah, they're doing it with voices now. So I know you're not a sci-fi fan, but Star Wars has a series on Disney Plus called The Mandalorian. And in that, in fact, I think it's the Book of Boba Fett, actually. But in it, there's Luke Skywalker, who I know you have heard of.
Is he the one that flies the Enterprise?
this is why I hate talking to you about this, but it's relevant to what we're talking about. And they digitally recreated Mark Hamill as he was in the third Star Wars series, so about 1984. And they used an AI to do his voice as he was in 1984. Now, what I believe they did in that case is they used Mark Hamill's performance, but then the voice synthesized it into something that sounded like him when he was, I guess, about 24.
Interesting.
But yes, it has much more far-reaching consequences than that.
I imagine lots of children are going to start writing their own stories. The story might go something like, so-and-so is too ill to come to school today. And then they might say to Alexa, please read this story in the style of my mum.
Yeah. That's the sort of thing I would have done. Actually, I wouldn't have done.
No, I might have signed my mum's name once or twice. I don't know.
One of the few times I actually not bunked from school because I stayed at home, but faked being ill, was not because I was ill, nor did I not want to go to school because I actually quite liked going to school. I was a bit of a geek. But I watched E.T., and there's a bit in E.T. where Elliot puts the thermometer on the light bulb to convince his mum he's got a temperature. Right. And I was just curious as to whether that would work. Turns out it did.
Excellent.
In fact, I had to go to the doctors and everything, which made it a bit awkward.
Oh.
As you can imagine.
One of those, how long do I keep this charade up for moments.
He's got a temperature of 60 degrees centigrade.
There's also been in the news as well that one or two, I think, two of the Google engineers now have been working on a chatbot, claim that it's now sentient.
Yeah, I've read this. What's your take on that? Because Google is saying, no, it's not. But the engineers involved are saying, no, it really is.
Well, I think it creates the illusion of sentience. And it's very difficult then when something is simulating a thing to figure out where does the simulation end and reality start.
Yeah. So it's passing the Turing test at some level.
Perhaps.
A bit like Erin.
Yeah.
She remarkably does remember to breathe, though.
Only sometimes.
I'm so mean to you, Erin, on the podcast.
Yeah.
That's because you deserve it.
Yeah, there's a Ryan Reynolds film that's come out fairly recently called, is it Free Guy?
Oh, yeah. What a
Have
great
you
film.
seen that? And the partially created Ryan Reynolds character at the end with all the muscles, but they've not finished all this speech. So it goes, catchphrase. Yeah. That's basically Erin.
It's good. Are you comfortable there, Pete?
No, I'm
Shuffling
fidgety
about a
today. Sorry, I got ants in my pants.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it may cause some disruption if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast. But of course, if you want to see our faces in glorious high definition,
Technicolor.
then search for the Constant Geekery podcast on YouTube.
Yeah, and you get to see Erin, so let that temper your decision.
We don't want to put people off. Right. Here's another piece of news. I've entitled it Apple Watch Saves Swimmer.
And when I first read that, I had visions of it kind of like grabbing the swimmer around the sort of and pulling it to the shore, but that's not quite what happened, is it?
Not really. So this was a lady who got stuck in a river in Colombia. I think it was Colombia. Or the Columbia
River in Oregon, a very different part of the world.
That is quite different, yeah.
Don't hear much about Oregon drug lords, do you?
Not really, no. So there's a lot of rain. She got caught out in the river. She got stuck. She was nearing exhaustion, but she was able to use her Apple Watch to call for assistance. That's pretty smart, isn't it?
That's cool. That's cool. I think that's a great application. Obviously, it would have had to have been the cellular version.
Yes, and you'd have to be in a signal area.
Yeah.
And it would probably also need to be the stainless steel version with the sapphire crystal, because if you've got the entry-level Apple Watch, like I have, and you happen to, just gently knock it and crack the screen, even just ever so slightly, then it's no longer waterproof. So you wouldn't be swimming with it.
You're a very cautious person with your gadgets.
Yes.
So that's a bit of an indictment there.
It is, but I thought it's not a problem, is it? Because it's just a little piece of glass, and you can get your iPhone glass replaced for not a lot of money. So, But it turns out you might as well just buy a new watch.
No, quelle surprise. But I suppose that's because Apple are thinking about the environment.
Yeah, I think all of the Apple Watches ought to have a sapphire crystal or at least mineral glass. You know, it needs to have something sensible.
Well, like a watch does, one might think.
That's a nice strap you're wearing there.
Yeah.
It almost looks, Pete, like you might be wearing a WSC London Oxford leather strap for your Apple Watch.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
If only someone was reviewing those premium level straps on a channel about geekery at some point in the near future. Then,
Well, to be honest with you, I would have bought one.
you didn't have to. I gave you one.
Thank you. Very kind.
It's all right. It's a lot better than the watch you bought me.
I was going to say, have you told the listeners about
Yes,
the...
we've jingled it in front of the microphone and everything.
Oh, excellent. On your video. But not the podcast
Yeah,
listeners.
we did. We had it on the podcast. So that just shows that you didn't listen to the podcast.
Was that
Erin
one where
did.
I wasn't here?
Yeah.
Oh, I just watched the joke to see if it's as good as mine. I did like the cow one, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Flock of cows.
A flock of cows. So, interestingly as well, if you're in the UK, we're on the 3 network for our phone. And I like the 3 network. Lots of people don't like it, but I think it gives you the best value for money. Works really well in our area. But a bit of a bugbear is they've never supported the cellular Apple Watch.
Now they do.
Now they do.
So well done, 3. We like you. Keep going.
So I don't think it costs a huge amount. Maybe a $5 a month or something like that if you've already got an Apple Watch, or you can go onto a contract, so you can add on a package with an Apple Watch for something like, I don't know, £10-12, something like that,
Awesome. That sounds great.
if you want an Apple Watch, which you might.
Yeah.
Final piece of news: Twitter. Now, I'm not going to talk about Elon Musk, but Twitter are trialing this new feature. So, quite famously, when Twitter was launched, it was limited to 140 characters, which meant people like Erin had to get really creative about, shortening what you say.
Erin's never said anything longer than 140 characters.
That's not true.
Good.
Point made. Well done.
So they changed it, didn't they, to 280 characters about 5 years ago?
Yeah.
But-
Just so that people could spread more hate in one tweet.
Yeah, that's it. And now they're introducing Notes, which is basically turning Twitter into a blogging platform. How do we feel about that?
What, that or Twitter in general? Don't get me started on Twitter.
Okay.
It's a cesspit of all that is vile in the world.
Some of our dear listeners are active on Twitter.
Including
Including-
a cesspit has some nice things fall into it sometimes.
I use Twitter.
I am
fact-
also on Twitter.
Yeah, you are.
I'm not saying I'm not on it. I'm just saying it's a horrible place in many instances.
It is. I got to be honest. I have on occasion had a little rant about companies or products that I don't like on Twitter, and I do question afterwards why I'm doing that. It's like it gives you a mouthpiece because the company's not listening to anything you've got to say, but if you say it in public, they might listen, and I think that's really sad, actually.
It is. Have you noticed that just my bit of news that's kind of related to this and complaining about companies as Hermes has rebranded? It happened a while ago, but I didn't notice.
This is Hermes, the delivery company.
Yeah, not Hermes, the Apple.
Exorbitant accessories. Yeah.
Yeah, they've rebranded to Every. And actually, things have started being delivered now. So I don't know if the rebrand coincides with them, actually shipping things. But yeah, so far so good.
Excellent. Well, that's good.
We'll see.
I think it's time for us to get on to the main topic.
Yeah, and I should warn the listeners this week that you've done all the heavy lifting on this. So
Have I, Pete? How unusual for the podcast.
He does all the heavy lifting. I just insert my intelligent repartee at the correct moments.
Oh, I'm looking forward to you doing that.
Yeah,
It hasn't happened yet, but
I was going to say I'm looking forward to me doing it one day. But anything appears intelligent when you're in the same room as that.
and for those who are just listening, Pete just pointed a finger at Erin. How do you feel about that, Erin?
For those not watching, I'm crying. There are tears rolling down my face. I'm very sad about
She's
it.
not pointing a finger back at me, relief, so that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
I'll give you the special form to file a complaint later.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Excellent. And
You have to
some
be
invisible.
human. You have to be a human being for that form to count.
I can't do the I'm not a robot thing.
This is harsh. Look, Erin, we've got to get on to the main topic, which I know you're itching to talk about.
M2. Woo! Yeah.
She actually remembered the number that went with it, so that's good. It's also in the notes, so in fairness, if she got it wrong, it would be...
Well, that suggests that she can read.
Actually, Erin, you said the other day on the podcast that you can't tell the time, but we actually did a review of some watch straps earlier, which we filmed, and you said you can tell the time.
I can now.
So which is it? Have you learned how to tell the time?
Well, I thought I couldn't. And then I was looking at a clock and it was just kind of like, yeah, no, I get that. So, yeah, now I do.
What twilight zone have I come into here?
Well, I only ever read digital.
I looked at a clock and thought, yeah, I get that.
Yeah. But I always knew the hours. And then I was looking at it and I was like, oh, okay, no, this does make sense. Previously, when I looked at clocks, I was like, no.
I think we need to have a word with your mum, because I'm pretty sure that most mums do teach their kids how to tell the time, with the big hand and the little hand. And you usually have a book where you can, a cardboard book.
I know exactly what you're talking about, yeah.
So you can teach it. You didn't have that.
I think I did it at school briefly.
Brilliant. In what year?
Like 2, 1?
Okay.
Another video coming up, Erin versus Sundial. That should be quite good, shouldn't it? Speaking of videos coming up, how are you coming on with your Apple Watch costume?
Oh, yeah, it's getting great.
Is it?
No.
Right, okay. Get on with it. So, yeah, M2 is now in the wild.
Yeah, M2. And this is where I'm going to put the chapter marker, by the way. So anybody who's skipping forward will just miss all of that delightful banter. Now, we said, I believe it might have even been last week, Pete, we were gently mocking the fact that the MacBook Pro 13-inch wasn't exactly flying off the shelves.
No.
However, since the reviews have come out, I noticed that on the same day the embargo lifted,
Yeah.
which was the Wednesday, and I think they were delivering on the Friday, suddenly the delivery dates started pushing out.
Seriously?
Yeah, so it seems to me that lots of people just hanging on, waiting for that embargo to lift so they could see the first reviews and then immediately purchase, which...
Doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't to me either, but this is what happened previously with M1, and what it means is that you're making a purchasing decision based on the first review that goes up, which will have been rushed up to get it up as the first review for the clicks and everything else. Is it going to have a reasoned, considered opinion? Because I don't think... I was trying to assess this in my mind. Is there actually a good reason for the MacBook Pro 13-inch M2 version? Should you buy it? And I was sort of coming around to the thought that actually maybe it has got some things to offer. But
Yeah.
And that I guess is kind of true, but for me, I would never buy one based on what we're about to talk about, because
Okay.
Apple, it's not quite what it's being made out to be, I don't think.
No, and the reviews are quite interesting, the written reviews that I've just scanned through here.
Yeah. So let's just start with some of the features that have been tested. So some folks have tested the battery. And, they got 23 hours, 15 minutes doing 4K video playback. So,
do you know what's impressive about that? The fact that they waited at least a full 24 hours before putting up their first review.
I haven't gone into great detail or watched loads and loads of reviews. So
At least someone did.
Someone did, but obviously all of these things are sourced from the internet.
That's pretty respectable.
I just want to make it clear though that we don't have a MacBook Pro 13-inch M2. We haven't personally tested one. We're just talking about what other people have said about it. I think we should be upfront about that.
Yeah, definitely.
So 18 hours battery with normal use, which I think is pretty similar to the M1 MacBook Pro, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
And that is the one advantage that the MacBook Pro has over the MacBook Air, is that battery life is slightly longer. But I mean, you might think differently, but once you get above 8 hours, does it even matter?
Well, I mean, there are those odd days where that extra battery life, particularly if it's a business day and you're working really hard, you're perhaps taxing your machine, you don't have a battery, doing a few Teams or Zoom calls, that's really useful. But I think I know what you're saying. After 8 hours of kind of looking at a screen, on the whole, you probably need a break anyway.
And I'm thinking that you would probably have access to a charger in that time.
One would think so. I mean,
So
yeah,
I don't think it, yes, the battery life is longer on the MacBook Pro versus the MacBook Air. Is it a deal breaker that, I desperately need that extra 2 hours of battery life or whatever it turns out to be? I'm not convinced by that. But it is a phenomenal thing. Are there any other laptops out there that can do this? Almost 24 hours of 4K video playback, which is, I would assume, with a low brightness setting, but even so.
yeah, not that I know of.
No, it's quite an amazing achievement, really. So and that's great. Let's just run through some of the benchmarks and talk about the actual M2 performance before we get on to the negatives. So let's start with Cinebench. Now, I think Cinebench is an interesting benchmark. I don't think it's fair to compare Apple Silicon with Intel machines using Cinebench. I don't think it's probably fair to do that with Geekbench either. I mean, all of these benchmarks, different chips have different performance metrics and do better in some things than other things. However, all of these benchmarks, when you're comparing the M2 to the M1, it's a very fair comparison, isn't it?
Definitely.
So this is where benchmarks really do come into their own. So there are the CPU, of course, that is in the MacBook Pro is the full fat version. So it's 8 CPU cores, for performance, for efficiency of the second generations, the newer generation to M1. And it's got 10 graphics cores. Now, everybody keeps saying that the MacBook Air is cheaper than the MacBook Pro. And the reason for that is because it has a bin chip in it with 8 GPU cores. So you get 2 fewer graphics cores if you go for the entry-level MacBook Air. If you spec it with the same CPU as the MacBook Pro, they are exactly the same price. In most markets.
So important to say.
So we're comparing that full flavour version of the M2 with the full flavour version of M1.
Okay.
If you recall, on the entry-level iMac and entry-level MacBook Air, you get a binned M1 chip with 1 fewer GPU core.
Yes.
Okay. So just to be clear about what we're comparing here. So the M2 scores 8,689. The M1 scored 7,729.
This is the Cinebench.
So this Cinebench multi-core 10-minute test.
Okay.
And you might see slightly different results from different reviews because every computer performs differently, and so there will always be a variety. But generally speaking, you're looking at a 12% multi-core improvement.
Okay. So in reality, 12% on multi-core. Are you going to notice that?
It really does depend what you're doing with the computer as to whether you'll notice that or not. I think for most tasks that most people do on a daily basis, no, you won't. But then you could say that about a lot of computers. If you really need that little bit of extra performance, perhaps you intend to use your computer to do some heavyweight lifting occasionally, then you will notice that difference. But 12% is a good generational improvement. I wouldn't have said it's night and day performance.
No, it's just the next step up, isn't it?
Something that we're quite keen to see, though, is how does the M2 compare to the bigger M1 chips? So the M1 Pro, the M1 Max, for example. And of course, there are different versions of those chips as well.
There is.
So let's start with the closest, which is the one that's in the entry-level MacBook Pro 14-inch and 6. No, just the 14-inch.
So that's the 8-core CPU.
Yes.
And doesn't that have some binned graphics?
It does. So the M1 Pro entry level has 8 CPU cores of the M1 generation, of course, but they are broken down into 6 performance cores and 2 efficiency cores.
Okay.
It has greater memory bandwidth.
Yep.
I think it's double. Could be wrong, but certainly more. And you get 14 GPU cores. You get 16 in the unbinned version. So that particular chip scores 9,515 in this same test, which means M2 gets 91% of the way to the binned M1 Pro.
It's pretty good.
It's not bad at all. If you take, though, the M1 Pro or M1 Max with the 10-core CPU.
Yeah.
So you get 2 extra performance cores. Then that scores 12,302. So M2 is getting you 71% of the way to a 10-core M1 Pro.
That is still not bad.
It's not bad, but it's also not a massively expensive upgrade on that entry-level MacBook Pro 14-inch to go up to the next chip. So you could spec a MacBook Pro 13-inch up with more storage, which you would definitely want to do, and more memory, which you will definitely want to do, as we're going to come on to. And you'll find that your pricing is getting very dangerously close to the M1 Pro. Now, Apple had to do this. They had to get that chip in that position, don't you think, where the M2 sits, in the whole lineup of things.
Yeah, they couldn't make it too powerful, because otherwise you're going to cut the legs out of any M1 Pro or Max sales.
Which Apple don't want to do.
No, well, why would they? And we'd be pretty annoyed as M1 Max owners if a new entry-level second-generation M chip came along that beat our Pro chips, or our Max chip in this case.
Yeah. So it definitely is to be considered as a replacement for the standard M1. It's not on the level of the Pro and Max, as we'll show in some of the other tests. So just take Cinebench single core. So same Cinebench R23. Bear in mind, this is the new generation of cores, and single core is the one area where it's really supposed to be better, which we really expected. But what we're seeing is not quite that.
No, it's only a 4% improvement. So M2 is scoring 1,584 versus the M1's 1,519. And again, as you say, chips vary, so that you could see some variation in that score as well.
Yeah.
It could be closer.
Yeah, so it is fast, a single core, and we'll see as well when we look at Geekbench that the difference is a little bit greater. But again, coming back to real world usage, would you ever notice it? So Eric, would someone like you ever notice it? And I don't mean that to be rude at all, but you're doing design work, you're doing video editing and stuff. Are you going to notice a 4% improvement?
No, not at all. I wouldn't even think twice about it. I wouldn't know what I was looking for, what I was looking at.
I mean, if the computer is fast enough to allow you to do your work, I think the only time you really notice this stuff is when you're
waiting.
Yeah, when you're blocked.
So renders,
that kind of
things
thing.
like that, where you literally, your workflow can't proceed until the computer has finished doing something.
Yeah, so long compiling for software developers, 3D rendering, video rendering, outputting. I mean, you could have a batch process outputting a load of images.
Yep.
But generally speaking, if the computer works at the speed that you work, you're just not going to notice these differences. And I think some of this is possibly also explained by the memory and SSD, as we're going to come on to. So perhaps M2 is actually capable of a bit more, but it's being held back in some way. Surely Apple wouldn't have done that.
No. Not.
What about if we take the venerable Geekbench 5 scores? Why don't we start with single core?
Okay.
Since we've just been talking about single core.
So here we see a 12% improvement.
Right.
So that's 1,937 on the M2 to the M1's 1,730.
So, that is fast. That is a really fast single core performance. That's right up there, I think there is an Intel chip that possibly outperforms that, but it is, that's amazing performance.
Definitely. Yeah, that's quite good.
It's not quite as much of a jump over the M1 Max single core performance.
No.
That's more like 9% improvement.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that the M1 Max has greater memory bandwidth. Again, I think it's 4 times the memory bandwidth.
Yeah. So that is going to have an impact.
And of course, the memory bandwidth in the M2 is greater than in the M1. It's about 30% more. Or is it 50% more?
Oh, I can't remember.
I saw someone in a video say it was 50% more, or they put up a graphic saying 50% more, and then said it's double the bandwidth. No, that's not right. It's 100 gigabytes a second, isn't it? And that is really fast. Anyway.
Oh yeah.
But the M1 was already really fast at whatever that is. It's 60, 70. It's quick. very fast compared to lots of other technology. So how about the multi-core scores, though?
Right, okay, this is where things get interesting. So the M2 scores 89,000.
No.
No, 8,000.
That would be amazing. If it scored 89,000,
You
then
heard
we'd
it
all
here
be fine.
8,968 for the M2 versus 7,554 for the M1, which represents a 19% improvement.
And I'm pretty sure when we spoke about this, we predicted somewhere around a 20%, 15 to 20% mark.
Yeah, we're pretty much spot on.
Yeah. Well, as are many other people. I mean, it's a fairly obvious.
I meant the royal we, the whole community of tech vloggers.
So very much as expected, because it's based on the A15 cores and we already know what difference they were to the A14. So the only anomaly was the memory bandwidth, and fairly straightforward prediction. So let's just then compare this again to the M1 Pro chip. So taking that binned version with the 8-core CPU.
So that's coming in at 9,948.
Okay.
So that's 90%. Oh, sorry, the M2 gets to 90% of the performance of that chip.
Right. And it was getting to 91% on the Cinebench test. So that's probably a fair indication.
Yeah.
So, it's not a massive leap up to go from M2 to M1 Pro, that binned version, but it's worth considering.
Yeah.
Because it is a performance jump. The 10-core version of the M1 Pro.
12,569.
Okay, so M2 again is hitting 71% of the M1 Pro.
Yeah.
And the M1 Max 10-core CPU, thanks to that additional memory bandwidth, just edges slightly higher again.
So that's 12,733. So M2 is 70% of that.
So it is if you go to that full-fat M1 Pro chip, it's a significant upgrade over M2.
Yeah.
So something to bear in mind. And something else to consider, of course, as well, is that the minimum memory that the M1 Pro chips come with is 16 gigs, whereas the M2 is 8 gigs.
Yeah, so that's going to make a difference to your workflow, as we found.
Yeah. So Xcode compiling is generally showing around 12% improvement, it would seem.
Over the standard M1 chip, the entry-level M1 chip.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's an improvement.
Yeah, if you've got a large software project that takes a long time to compile, you are going to notice that.
You could be grateful of that extra 12%.
Yeah. Let's just talk about graphics a moment. So, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Now, but bear in mind you've got 2 extra GPU cores. The GPU cores, I think, are running slightly faster. You've got that additional memory bandwidth, so we would expect more performance. But on the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark, set to the 1920 by 1200 resolution on highest setting, the M2 delivers 29 frames per second versus the M1's 20 frames per second. And that is a 45% improvement. I've done my math right.
That's pretty impressive.
I think that's massively impressive. And that's where the M2 definitely makes sense as an upgrade to the M1, in that you're getting much better GPU performance. But let's just keep this in context. It's still not amazing GPU performance. Would you want to play a game like, I've never played it, but would you want to play a game like Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 29 FPS?
Well, let's ask Erin, because she looks bored. Erin, would you like to play Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 29 FPS?
I would not.
Why not?
I would like more frames per second.
Would you? How many would you like?
Take like 40.
Take 40.
40?
I think that would be... I'm assuming that this is an average and it's going to be variable anyway. So 29 FPS, if you're getting that kind of average, that's not really that playable. That's not even up to sort of Nintendo Switch experiences.
Right. I'm not a gamer, so I can...
Well, I think you want your game to be 60 FPS plus.
Right.
If you're serious about gaming. But, no serious gamer who wants to play a heavyweight title like that is going to go out and buy an M2 Max, surely.
I wouldn't have thought so.
So this is more about casual gaming, and if you are doing some casual gaming on the side with your computer, then having a 45% improvement, that's pretty good. Pete's just fired up the inbuilt chess app.
Well, I'm just curious to see if I can what that is smooth. Did you
is
see
it
how
smooth?
many?
E75.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Pete.
Excellent. Okay.
So you can also play chess. Can you focus on what we're doing? Or?
Yeah. I was just. It was part of.
You're not going to win.
E7 to D5.
You won't win
Thought about it. Why won't I win?
because you've got an M1 Max. So it's going to thrash you.
It's like deep thought
with those neural engines and whatnot.
Okay.
I do want to talk about Geekbench 5 Metal score. Now,
Okay.
with all of the caveats that the metal test in Geekbench 5 is unable to fully test some of these Apple CPUs, or GPUs, sorry,
Why is that?
because it just doesn't run long enough to push them hard enough
Right. Okay.
to get a sensible score. And we saw some very variable scores when we were testing the M1 Max, but the M1 Max is way beyond the performance of the M2. And at the lower performance levels, I'd say it's consistent enough to give us an idea.
Okay.
So, running the Geekbench 5 Metal Compute test on the M2 GPU, the 10-core version. So this is not the one you get in the entry-level MacBook Air. It's a $100 or £100 upgrade, but it is the one that you get in the MacBook Pro 13-inch.
Okay.
And that scores
30,627 for the M2 versus 21,754 for the M1. So that's a 41% improvement.
which is fairly consistent with what we've seen then in the Tomb Raider benchmark.
Is it a good benchmark, though?
Possibly not, but the fact that I think at these lower levels, it is okay. Where it falls down is on when you're getting up to the 16 GPU cores and the 32 and so on and so forth. Those scores, though, just to put that into context, 30,000 on a laptop, it wasn't so long ago. Erin, you've got the i7 16-inch there, and I think that's got a 5300M in it.
Me
And
too.
Dear, I thought you might think that, and I'm pretty sure the 5300M would not score as high as 30,627 on Geekbench.
Why don't you run that while we're talking and
Yeah, I'll
let us know the results?
Let me just type in some code.
Erin's used to running Geekbench. I'll tell you what, I will just casually look it up whilst we're talking.
Okay.
But I'm fairly certain that you do,
Would you like me to read out the other scores while you do that?
do that, please. Yeah.
So the M1 Pro with the 14-core GPU, so that's the one with the 2 GPU cores that have been binned, scores 36,601 compared to the M2's 30,627. So the M2 is 84% as good as that 14-core GPU. The 16-core GPU, this is the M1 Pro again, scores 39,295. So the M2 is 78% as manly or womanly or as butch, I don't know what the right word is, as that. And then finally the M1 Max 24-core GPU, because why would you ever want more than that, is 61,880, which is 49%. The M2 is 49% as good as that.
Yeah. So if you want serious graphics performance, you've got to go with one of those chips. I mean, it gets fairly close to the M1 Pro, but it's still a significant enough upgrade. And don't forget, what this metal score is not taking into consideration is memory bandwidth and a total amount of memory.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So I've looked up the 5300M that is in Erin's Intel MacBook Pro 16-inch, and that scores 24,857.
Okay. Yeah, so the M2's beating it, but not the M1.
Yeah, but in real life, we know, of course, that particular GPU chokes because it's got 4 gigs of video RAM, and of course the M2 will be able to use the entire system RAM.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that we keep reiterating. It's not just one figure. You've got to take a look at the whole system and what you're doing with it.
Yeah. So this is actually, this level of performance you're getting on for the Fire Pro D700, which was the top graphics card in the 2013 Mac Pro workstation, one of them. Obviously, it had 2 of them, but you're getting up to the performance of one of them.
That's impressive.
In just raw compute performance. Again,
in a laptop.
Yeah, and it's ahead of the Radeon Pro 5500M as well, which featured as an upgrade in the 16-inch MacBook Pro. So this is a really good performance, a good result, and it will be even better than these chips that we're just talking about because of the access to memory and the memory bandwidth. So this is just a raw compute calculation benchmark.
Yeah.
So
here's a question for you then.
yeah,
This is obviously in the MacBook Pro 13, which has cooling. Will the M2 MacBook Air, which does not have cooling, do you think it will be noticeably slower than these benchmarks?
noticeably so. In the benchmarks, I would expect that it might be in longer tests because these chips are generating a lot of heat now.
Do your fans come on much? I notice you've got your little doohickey up there that says whether the fans are on or not.
No, very rare.
Is that a third-party utility?
It is. That's TG Pro that I'm using. Yeah, fans are usually off. So my M1 Max in normal use is at 42 degrees. And this is the great thing with Apple Silicon. Most of the time, of course, you don't need the cooling.
No.
So it's only when you're doing those longer, all the renders and the things we were talking about, compiles, that where the cooling could be noticeable. Bear in mind, though, this MacBook Pro 13-inch has one fan in it. It's not the most amazing cooling system in the world. The M1 version wasn't massively better than the M1 MacBook Air. And actually, some people did a thermal pad modification so that it used the case of the MacBook Air to
Like a heat sink.
Yeah. And that was then performing at the same level. So will it be noticeably slower? In the benchmarks, I think you'll be able to see a difference.
Okay.
We'll have to wait and see, but I expect so. In real life, no.
Probably not so much.
I don't think.
I think a lot of the reviews are saying when you look at the M2 13-inch MacBook Pro in isolation, in a vacuum, it's a good machine. But when you consider that the MacBook Air is coming, hopefully next month, then maybe not. I do wonder if Apple have deliberately held back the M2 MacBook Air to just try and shift some of these units.
Right. Yeah, you touch on a good point. So let's start getting to the negatives.
Okay.
So we postulated, surmised, we predicted, posited, whatever the word is, that Apple were making use of existing stock that they had, because we don't think the MacBook Pro 13-inch was a big seller. Apple claim it's their second best-selling notebook, but I suspect they're referring to the entirety of the 13-inch MacBook Pro, and also when they actually did the the 4-port version with the top-end Intel chips, which was a really good notebook.
Yeah.
So maybe over an average of many years, it is their second best-selling notebook. But I don't personally think the M1 MacBook Pro has sold a lot.
No.
I see a lot of M1 MacBook Airs around, but not M1 MacBook Pros. So it is basically the same chassis. It actually also looks like, looking at the teardown pictures, I can't see much difference in the logic board either. I haven't had a really close look. Perhaps someone will comment in the comments section who has taken the time to have a look. But is it even a new logic board? Or have they just taken off the M1 chips off of their stock of MacBook Pro logic boards and popped in an M2? Is that possible? I don't know.
Well, could make it user serviceable if it is.
No, let's be clear. I don't imagine for a moment there's a socketed socketed system on a chip there. But I'll tell you what, a very telling thing is that people are receiving these items in boxes that have stickers on them.
Do they have now stickers on them?
Yes. So,
And what does the sticker say underneath?
I would imagine it's an M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch box, and they've put a sticker over it with the new specifications.
So let me put my Apple marketing exec head on and say, well, we had boxes left over, and because of our concern for the environment, we thought we'd reuse those.
Yes, it could be that. It could be the concern. Do you think it's concern for the environment, Erin?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom.
What I like about Erin is the insight she brings. It's not just that single syllable answer. It's the backing up of that, which I really appreciate.
Yep.
Go on, Erin. Elaborate on why you don't think it's just for the environment.
I think that the whole environment thing that Apple does is just for show. And if they really cared, they'd donate money to people who can actually help the environment.
Surely not.
Hot take.
Careful, don't get political over there, Erin.
Sorry.
Wow. Okay.
So I do think that there are stockpiles of these machines, second best-selling machines, which are not selling, and Apple needs to get them sold.
Aren't they going to be gutted when they all get sent back within 30 days?
Well, I wonder how many will get returned on the basis of what's been found out. So
I'd be pretty disappointed. I don't know why. It's a box, but...
So, I mean, getting a CPU to offer greater performance, there's basically a couple of... Let's simplify it. And I'm sure someone's going to comment and point out the technicals, this, that, and everything else. But let's just simplify things down. What are your options when you want to run a chip faster? What can you do?
Oh, you can make it bigger.
Yeah, so add more stuff to it. Yeah.
You can increase the clock speed.
Yeah, give it more power. So if you're going to increase the clock speed, you've got to give it more power. Or you've got to increase the density, move to a smaller production process. So just to be clear, these are not, Apple are not down to 3 nanometer process here.
No, this is 5, isn't it? So, but what we're saying is the denser the better. Denser is good. Hear that, Erin?
Yeah.
And the M2 does have more transistors on it than the M1. But however, it also has additional hardware that the M1 doesn't have. So, for example, if you're working with ProRes or ProRes RAW, there's now an encoder and decoder on board the chip for those things, and you don't get that with M1. So, the benchmarks that we've just given out obviously don't factor any of that specialism into the consideration. If you're working with those formats, the M2 is obviously going to be better. If I say that, I have actually seen videos where it doesn't appear to be that much better, but that may just be a software optimization thing.
Interesting.
What we are seeing, though, is Apple is chucking more power at this. So if we take the Cinebench single-threaded test, for example, so the M1 needs 4 watts of power to do that, and the M2 needs 5 watts of power.
So a whole more 1 wattage.
Which, in the whole scheme of things, this is incredible. You find an Intel chip that gets anywhere like that on idle, it's not going to score anything like this. That is an amazing performance, and it is just 1 watt at the end of the day. But another way to look at it, though, is that's 25% more power being used.
Yeah.
But we're not getting a 25% performance improvement.
No.
So we're now venturing into the realm of diminishing returns. If we take the multi-threaded test, the M1 needs 15 watts, the M2...
19.
That's 27%. But we're not getting a 27% performance increase.
Did you say 27%?
I may have said that.
That's okay. It's nice to hear you make a foible for a change, because it's normally me.
That's right. I make lots of mistakes. This podcast is one of them.
Yeah.
Employing Erin, starting a business with you. There's so many mistakes, so many things I regret in life.
Yeah. I could get really harsh at this point, but I'm not going to. Anyway, some people think Erin's your daughter.
I don't think anybody still thinks that. Try not to vomit over there, Erin, if you can.
I was just thinking about mistakes.
Oh.
Multi-threaded.
Excellent. So looking at these, these tests were done by Angstronomics, extracted notebook check measurements by Angstronomics. So I can't remember where I got these from, sorry, but hopefully I've got that correct. What they noticed is at high temperature, when they did a full-on stress test with Cinebench R23.
In a sauna.
The difference was 50% power draw.
On the M2. Wow.
Yeah, but there certainly wasn't 50% improvement. They also did a wildlife extreme test.
What is that?
That is
Is that an actual elephant in the room?
No, it's an iPad benchmark.
Right.
But it does run on the Apple Silicon.
I've run it. Yes, I ran it for you on some tests we did.
So I have used it in the past. And on that, it pulled an extra 35% of power. But it is delivering that level of performance, it is actually delivering 36% more performance on this test. So when it comes to the GPU, it's you're drawing extra power, but you're getting the return for it.
Yeah.
When it comes to the CPU, not so much.
No.
So I guess the thought is, if you've got two laptops with the same battery capacity, and you're pushing them both to the limit,
Yeah, the
one of
M2 is
them's
going to
gonna-
run out sooner.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Still, though, let's not over exaggerate or get too overexcited about this. 19 watts for a 8 core CPU that's able to perform at this level is a pittance, isn't it? It's just incredible. They're still incredible chips. I just think it's a little bit telling of what possibly is happening with Apple. And is this? In fact, we've got something in the Rumour Mill. Maybe we'll talk about in the Rumour Mill what Apple is actually doing here with these chips.
Okay.
Here's the thing that's really got people upset, though. It would appear we've got yet another Apple Silicon SSD gate, Pete.
Great.
So, Max Tech did some great reviews, as they always do. They really go to great lengths, those chaps. They tested the SSD, and the reason why they tested the SSD is because Apple conveniently didn't talk about the SSD at WWDC.
No, I noticed that.
So they were very keen to test it, and what they found is on the 256 gig model, so that's the entry model, 25% slower on write, 50% slower on read.
You're kidding.
No.
That's abominable compared to what are they comparing that to?
To the M1 with 256 gig.
So it's an inferior SSD.
Well, it's not an inferior SSD as such. They took it apart to show the difference. There are two spaces for NAND chips. So we know with the M1 and M2 chips that the SSD controller is part of the system on chip.
Yeah.
So all you have is these NAND flash chips, which are in fact soldered to the board in this case. And there is just one chip for this particular model.
Okay.
So whereas there used to be two, so they used to have two 128s. Now it's just got one 256.
So when you've got the two, they're running in parallel.
They can do that, yes, to improve performance.
Okay.
Yeah,
And obviously that's not an option with one.
Yeah, and this is typically why we've previously said on the channel larger capacity SSDs will run faster, and that's because often they've got a greater number of chips. So there's a level of multi-channel running in parallel kind of stuff going on. You get the same thing on the Mac Studio. So I think on 256 and 512 it's just one slot populated, but there's two slots if you go for the top end storage. Sorry, hit my microphone there. So why are Apple doing this? And why did they conveniently forget to tell us about it at WWDC?
I was about to say I'll put my marketing exec hack back on again and just say, well, one SSD, less landfill.
Yeah, possibly not.
It's got to be a cost saving or a supply chain issue, isn't it?
Yeah, because you reduce the number of SKUs. So if you're offering, I can't remember what all the different storage options are, but now they don't have to stock 128 gig NAND chips.
Interesting.
They just have the 256. So I assume, and I could be wrong with this. In fact, I probably am wrong. But if you go to 512, would they put two 256s on? Probably not. They'd probably just go one 512.
So a 512 may not solve the problem.
Possibly you'd have to go up to 1 terabyte or something to get the performance back that you already got with M1. And that's it. Let's be clear here. In real world usage, once an SSD gets above 700 megabytes a second or around about that, you really don't notice the difference unless you're doing a specific file copy or something that's very intensive. Yeah, if you just take video editing, for example, we shot some footage earlier in Blackmagic Raw 6K, and you can quite happily edit that off of a external T7 drive.
Yep.
So going to a fast drive won't make a difference to you in that case because it's fast enough already. And that's basically the principle that a lot of things that happen on your computer, it's already fast enough. But there is one key area on the Apple Silicon chips where the very fast SSD has had an impact.
That's a swap file.
Yeah. So we found that, when we first tested M1, it was doing a lot of swapping. And because the SSD was so quick,
You didn't really notice it until you filled up
Yeah,
the swap file.
yeah. Which was very hard to do. It's very hard to get an 8 gig M1 to really fall over. You've got to push it quite hard, haven't you? So I'm thinking, if you've only got 8 gigs of RAM and you've now got an SSD that is half the speed for reading and 25% slower on writing, surely that's going to have an impact on swap performance.
It's got to. So I'd love to get my hands on an M2 just to see if we can make that happen. But I guess what we would say, based on what we know, well, we already say don't get 8 gig. Don't get 8 gig of RAM with an M chip machine,
unless you're only doing, very basic
General
computing
tasks.
general computing tasks.
But if you're doing editing or anything with any serious intent behind it, go for the 16. But I think this reinforces that.
Yeah.
And also don't go for the 256, possibly not even the 512 SSD,
Yeah.
which suddenly adds a whole load of costs to your purchase.
Well, you are really whacking it up, aren't you? 16 gigs and a 1 terabyte SSD. And
just
I'm just curious as well to know, will the M2 MacBook Air have the same problem? So is it going to be slower than the M1 MacBook Air
interesting.
when it comes to SSD? So I think if you were to select, Pete, so you're just on the US website, I think you should choose the second of the two standard specifications. So the one
with the 512 already.
Yeah, because and then you're also getting the non-binned version of the chip in that model as well. So if you add 16 gigs of unified memory and a terabyte of storage, you're up to $1,900. And that, as we've said before, like, you're knocking on the door of the MacBook Pro 14-inch. I think it's another $300 to get a MacBook Pro 14-inch in the same spec. And just why wouldn't you do that? Faster SSD, better performance from CPU and GPU, more ports, better screen. It's just a much better machine. So do these MacBook Pros make any sense at all?
Well, we said this last week. No, we don't think they do.
Yeah, so sorry if
I'm really struggling with it.
Yeah, sorry if you've bought one. I understand why some people would go for it with they like the form factor, they like the touch bar, and that's great. But go in with your eyes open. I feel like Apple is shortchanging slightly. If it doesn't feel like a fair thing to, they're essentially clearing stock of a product by putting a new chip in it. And the new chip itself, I'm not sure about. I think the supply chain issues have maybe impacted this.
Yeah, I don't think things are going as Apple originally envisaged them, because nothing is for anyone really. No one envisaged the last 2.5 years that we've been through, and goodness knows what's coming.
So perhaps we should enter the Rumour Mill, Pete.
Tom, you know what to do.
Constant geekery, you already know the name. Turn the volume up, this is Pete and Dave.
And Erin.
What rumours have you heard? Let us test the claim. Are they facts or are they lies?
We do need to get a new jingle.
We do.
As good as that one is, it's everything needs to be upgraded. We need
get
Rumour
my,
Mill jingle M2.
Penny whistle out.
I'll get my banjo out.
Brilliant.
I can't even play a banjo. So I think we got one rumour this week by the looks of it.
Yeah, so this was a tweet I saw from Vadim Yuriev from Max Tech. And Vadim has got a theory on the M2 chip. What he's saying is Apple delayed the real M2 chip and gave us a stopgap chip based on the A15, which was also a stopgap chip itself.
So the M2 that we're getting isn't the M2 that they originally intended to give us.
What do you make of that rumor? Should we grade it first on our traffic light system?
It makes a lot of sense, but it's also one of those ones that is so hard. How could you ever know? So I'm going to say amber.
I'm just going to push the boat out and go for a green on this one.
Are you?
I think what we've got is not what Apple wanted to give us.
Okay.
Whether it's not the real chip and or the delay of the real chip and a stopgap, that's just semantics, isn't it? But I don't think it's what Apple wanted to do. I suspect they wanted to release the Mac Pro at WWDC and they weren't able to do that. These are the realities of the world we find ourselves in 2022. Apple are hit just like everyone else. They may be doing a very good job of making out that it's not happening and not affecting them, but it is, clearly.
Has to be.
Yeah. So I would have thought what we said previously is probably true. Although I don't want to sort of say, oh, we were right and it's just the market conditions why things didn't turn out the way we said. But it would have made more logical sense to create the M2 chip on TSMC's new fabrication process and to go with a 3 nanometer process. That would have made a lot of sense. It just seems to me like this is like a lot of the decisions Apple are making, it seems all about reducing the number of parts and thus controlling their supply chain a bit better.
For the environment.
So was the A15 itself a stopgap chip? I don't know. Perhaps Apple would have liked to have done more with that. But M2 based on the A15, I mean, I thought they would wait for the next set of cores before they brought out M2.
Yeah.
And to have a bigger generational leap, particularly as, people who have spent a lot of money on their computer. I mean, we're sat here with the MacBook Pro 14-inch with the M1 Max in. That's not a cheap laptop. Everyone knows that. How long would you expect that to be in active service for you?
At least 5 years.
Yeah. And within our business, we'd expect a laptop costing that much to get. We'd expect to get 5 years use out of it, and then for it to still have a life after that.
Yeah.
That we'd sell it on to staff members or people we know, or even on eBay. So it's a little bit distasteful to me for them to be changing things so quickly.
Yeah. And, we've talked along the way about our Apple trying to move with computers to what they do with phones, which is kind of trying to force that 12-month upgrade psychology, which I think, again, the word is distasteful if that's what they're trying to do.
Well, it flies in the face of all of the environmental claims that we spoke about.
And it's not sustainable for most people, including businesses. We are in a lucky position as business owners, if that's the right term. We're in a position where, because of the work we do, we have the equipment to support that. But not everyone is, and it puts a massive strain on businesses or people personally if they have to, or feel like they have to keep upgrading to have the right performance for their business. It's just a bit naughty, I think.
Well, I think the way Apple will go with this, I think they'll do it with phones, and I believe this is being widely rumoured. It's likely to happen is that Apple is increasingly getting into finance roles, and I think that they will start to offer the
short-term leases.
Yeah, phones on a rental program, that kind of thing. I mean, they sort of do it anyway.
They do. They just use partners at the moment.
Yeah. So I think it's Barclays in the UK that underwrites it, but the iPhone replacement planning already exists. Why wouldn't they do the same thing for a laptop? People will sign up to it, especially if they can do monthly payments. That's the way. That's great business for Apple because it allows them to retain their premium level pricing and keep their market position without undermining that, but also make it accessible to everybody by getting them to sign up on the tick.
Which is exactly what they've done with iPhones. And you can't fault their business acumen, but what does it mean for society as a whole? That sounds a bit grand, doesn't it, for the podcast? But
these are deep and meaningful topics that need more consideration, perhaps. Anyway, those are our thoughts on the M2 MacBook Pro 13-inch. So some plus points, but generally speaking, a bit of an odd machine in the lineup. Why does it exist other than to clear Apple's stock of parts?
Bit of a damp squib.
Yeah. Although you could make the argument that if they've got the stuff already engineered, then it's good for the environment that they're making use of it. But I think they should be more upfront about what it is. Of course, that's not in the Apple way of doing things, is it?
No. Bit of obfuscation.
I think that revelation with the SSD, I'm gobsmacked at that. It's such a backward step. And, it's not even you look at the actual performance figures, it's not even a particularly great performing SSD now.
No.
So, what do you think about this, folks? I'm sure you'll let us know in the comments section. Have you bought an M2 MacBook Pro 13-inch? Do you like it? Are we wrong? In which case, please tell us how we're wrong. And are you thinking to yourself, I'm going to wait for the M2 MacBook Air, but are you now going to wait to see whether or not the M2 MacBook Air has the same issues before you place an order?
Definitely Be curious to see what happens there.
Yeah. Very good.
Well, thanks for watching, I guess we need to say, and thanks for joining us, Erin, and for your insightful comments as always.
That's what I'm here for.
Erin's
Yeah.
basically just been browsing the web the whole time.
I haven't.
There was a comment in last week's podcast, I don't know if you saw it, that put the words intellectual and attractive and Erin in the same sentence.
Yeah?
Yeah. That's never happened before, has it?
No.
Yeah. Unless the sentence was something like Erin is neither intellectual nor attractive. I suppose that would work.
Is it one of those triangle things where you can only have two of the three? So you can have an attractive Erin, but she's not an intellectual. You can have an intellectual Erin who's not attractive, or you can have an intelligent,
Attractive person that's not Erin.
yeah.
Thank you so much for watching the podcast. Please join us on YouTube. That's like so
On that note,
On that note,
Cheerio.
Before we do,
Oh, what?
just hold that thought a minute. You're off on your travels.
yes.
Pete's got to do some business abroad. So whilst you're doing that, whether or not that is going to impact our podcast schedule,
It is.
that's for sure. So over the next few weeks,
May have some guest pods.
I may try and get a guest podcast going, but there will be fewer than usual, so we will miss at least 1 week, I should think, possibly
least.
even two.
Yeah.
So apologies for that, folks, but that's the nature of business.
My jet set lifestyle.
And yeah, that. Thanks for tuning in today, and see you again soon on the Constant Geekery podcast.
Cheerio.
Cheerio.